Good afternoon. Welcome to the Lubar Center and Marquette Law School and this latest and final pre-election release of our statewide Marquette Law School poll. Thank you for being here and thank you for your interest in what your fellow citizens think. That's really what we're trying to get at with the poll, and so we'll move ahead with that. I'm going to open with something that I always close with in the final pre-election poll, but I figure I might as well do it right up front rather than wait till the end. Just remember, polls do not vote. People vote. It's up to you, not up to the poll. So I'll remind you of that at the end, just in case you need the reinforcement. But please do seriously think that. Keep that in mind. That is the critical part of our democratic system. So let's move right ahead into the topics of the day. These might be getting familiar to you. We'll go through the methodology of the poll, as we always do. Then we'll move to the general election matchups with a week to go, now 6 days to go. Look at certainty of voting and how that is changing and how it has changed from the last poll, and where that leaves us both for certainty of voters turning out and our uncertainty about what the final turnout looks like. Look at the candidate images. We've seen an awful lot of advertising and campaigning this year. Where do the candidates stand here just before the election? And then the issue concerns that we've tracked all year long to see how people focus on what issues and how that differs. And then some particular issues, some that we've done before and a couple of new ones to come to for the first time. And so that's the rundown of where things stand. Oh, and of course, how people are feeling about the state and about their own financial well-being and those sorts of things. So that's the gist of the day. The methodology is unchanged. It's the same as we've been doing for now over a decade. The survey was in the field October 24th until November 1st. Yes, last night we finished interviews at about 9:30. And so this one, we went a little later than we usually do. Usually we wrap up on Sundays, but we've been expanding the window of the interviewing a little bit to try to reach some of those notoriously hard to reach folks. In this sample, 802 registered voters, 73% were interviewed by cell phone, 27% by landline. The full sample has a margin of error of a little over 4%, 4.6 percentage points. And for the sample of likely voters, 679 likely voters, that margin of error is plus or minus 4.8 percentage points. So round it up and call it a 5-point margin of error when you're looking at all of the numbers every time. Partisan makeup of the sample is pretty close to where we usually are. 30% Republican, 28% Democratic, 41% Independent. If you include the people who are independent, but say they lean to one party or another, that puts it up to 46 Republican, 44% Democratic, the same 2-point margin, and 9% Independent. The substantive thing I wanted to say is it's really pretty interesting that we get 16% of independents that lean Democratic and 16% that lean Republican. And that balance, sometimes it's 15 in each, but it's almost always pretty similar, and that's what it is this time as well. Over the long haul since 2020, we've been running 30 Republican, 28 Democratic, 41 Independent, the same as this sample. And on the with leaners, just 1 point closer, 45, 44 instead of a 2-point difference. So very little difference in partisanship from our usual. Okay, so we want to go to the general election matchups and the, sorry, do I want to give you the headline or not? No, I'll just go through the numbers one at a time. So let's look at the Senate race. It's a 2-point Johnson lead, 50 to 48. That's a tightening from a 6-point Johnson lead 3 weeks ago in our previous poll. You can see there's very little undecided, though remember that if someone initially says they're undecided, we do ask, do you lean to one candidate or to another? Also, this is among, as you can see in the title, among likely voters. And likely voters in our sample, as in many polls, though there are differences, are the people who say they are absolutely certain they're going to vote this time, or who say they've already voted. Okay, so those two are combined, and those are our likely voters in the survey. I don't actually have a slide for it, but just so you know, those two together are 80% of registered voters. 4 years ago, we had 82% at this time who said they were certain to vote. The actual turnout 4 years ago was 82.2%. Okay, back to this point. That would suggest that maybe we're a shade lower, but just a shade lower than the exceptionally high turnout we had 4 years ago. And that 82.2 of actual, that's based on the number of people who were registered to vote just before the election, just so you know, in the actual turnout. So I think we'll be very close to 2018 turnout. We might be a shade low, but it'll be so little a shade low that I don't think it makes much difference. On the other hand, it could be that we get a surge in turnout here at the end. Okay, so with likely voters, it's a 2-point advantage for Johnson. That's obviously inside the 5-point margin of error. So the right characterization of this is purely a toss-up race at this point. Here's the trend since August. And again, with likely voters, in August, we had Barnes up by 7 right after the primary. Then Johnson by 1 point in early September. And then we had him up by 6 points 3 weeks ago. And now that race has tightened to 2 points. So if there was a little widening of the gap last time, there's now a tightening of the gap. You'll see that some of that comes from a little bit higher Democratic expected turnout. We'll see that in a minute. On the governor's race, though, we have a dead tie, 48-48. This is truly reminiscent of 4 years ago when we had the governor's race dead tied in the final poll as well. And so deja vu here. This race hasn't moved around a lot. It's just tightened a little bit. In August, it was a 4-point Evers lead, then a 3-point lead, then 3 weeks ago, it was a 1-point Evers margin, and now it's a dead tie. So it's just gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. Whereas the Senate race has moved around a bit, the governor's race has not moved much and just tightened. Also, I would recommend you take a look at all the other polling that's being done in the state by other organizations. What you see there is pretty much the same pattern. There are a few differences between polls, but they're generally pretty close to agreement on a pure toss-up in the governor's race. And there's been a range of results in the Senate race. So a little more variability in the Senate. As you saw, we saw a little bit of an opening of a gap, but then this closing here at this point. What's going on? Well, let's look at partisanship and how that's changed. The top left is this time 95% of Democrats voting for Evers, 97% of Republicans voting for Michaels. So we've seen that all along. Last survey in early October, you saw that 88% of Republicans for Michaels. That's now back up to 97. It had been at 92 and 92 before that. So if there was any kind of slippage 3 weeks ago, it's now completely gone. And Republicans are as unified as Democrats, or even just a shade more unified, but it's very high. Look at the independents, the purple bars, 47% for Evers, 46% for Michaels. Hard to tell the difference there. It was 43-44, 1 point the other way 3 weeks ago. It had been 45-39 in September, more of an Evers advantage and a little bigger advantage still in August. So how has this race tightened? It's easy to see that among independents, there's been this shift from a bit of an Evers edge to a tightening, and in the last two, really 1 point differences either way. Finally, those little tiny bars show a 2% Republican crossover to Evers and a 2% Democratic crossover to Michaels. So no meaningful crossover voting to begin with, but what there is dead even right now. So that's what a dead even race looks like. And how modest the change has been over the season, except for those independents drifting a bit towards dead even between Michaels and Evers. In the Senate race, there's also been a little bit of change. Hugely unified parties, 98% of Democrats for Barnes, 97% of Republicans for Johnson. There has been a little change among Democrats. If you start in the bottom right after the primary, we were at 99% of Democrats for Barnes. Pretty much in the end, not very contested primary as people dropped out. Then that went to 96, and then last time it was at 93 before now going back up to 98. So if there had been a little bit of erosion in support for Mandela Barnes during the course of the campaign, that is now gone away and party is unified. There's been far less change in the support for Ron Johnson among Republicans. Started at 94, 97, 96, 97. There's just great party unity there. But independents have shifted in this race. Start in the bottom right, and we started out in August with a 15-point Barnes advantage with independents. That went to a 2-point Johnson advantage in September, a 6-point Johnson advantage earlier this month, and now a 7-point Johnson advantage with independents. So Johnson seems to have opened up that advantage with independents, but Barnes at the same time has recovered some of his support with Democrats. The net effect of that is tightening this race just a little bit. 2 points is still a clear toss-up in this race. There are some, but smaller differences depending on how many people turn out to vote. I just told you, when we talk about likely voters, we're talking about people who are absolutely certain, say they're absolutely certain to vote or that they've already voted. When we talk about all registered voters, the bigger sample, that's everybody who's already registered or who tell us at the beginning of the interview that they will get registered by Election Day. And since we do have the blessings of Election Day registration, that can happen right up till Election Day. So we include those. It's not a very big part of the sample, but we include anybody that says that in the registered voter sample. If you look at certainty of turnout by party, it's this time 83% of Republicans say they're certain or they've already voted, but 89% of Democrats say the same thing. So a bit of a Democratic advantage right now on that measure. If you look earlier in the month, it was 84 Republican, 83 Democrats, basically a tie. It had been a 3-point Democratic advantage in September and a 1-point Republican advantage. So thing number one is turnout is something that can change right up to election evening at 7:59 p.m., right? Assuming you live close enough to your polling station to get there in less than 1 minute and get in line. So there's always greater uncertainty about turnout. People can change their minds. A friend that says, hey, let's go vote is all the difference between a voter and a friend who says, hey, let's go get a beer. Right? Be the first, not the second kind of person, right? So there is that. Another thing is that the advantage for Democrats right now is coming entirely from people who say they've already voted. 10% of Democrats have already voted, 3% of Republicans have. So if you take those folks out and just look at the intention to vote among those who haven't voted yet, then the two are again even. So, you know, it may well be that Republicans make up that gap on election day or possibly before election day. It's possible that Democrats really have managed to mobilize their voters and take advantage of early voting better than Republicans have. But at the moment, we're seeing a bit of an advantage for Democrats in turnout compared to what we saw earlier in the year when the advantage was smaller. But again, it's driven almost entirely by the people that tell us they've already voted. How sensitive it is, how sensitive the vote outcome is to turnout is not as sensitive as we've seen in some other polling this year. If you look at the green bar here, this is everybody. This is all registered voters. And in that, for the governor's race, Michaels has a 1-point advantage, 45-44. When you go to the purple bar, those are folks who are either certain to vote or have already voted, or who say the second category of likelihood of voting, saying, I'm likely to vote, but not I'm certain I'm going to vote. If you do that, then we get the tie, 47-47. And then when we move just to the likely voters, it's again a tie at 48-48. So very little movement here. The slight movement towards Michaels is coming because with all registered voters, you don't have that modest Democratic edge among likely voters. If we look at the preferences between the likely voters and the less than likely voters, then the two green bars are those likely voters, the absolutely certain or have already voted, and that's the 48-48 tie. If you look at the purple bars, those are everybody that's anything other than sure to vote. And it's 31-34, a slim advantage to Michaels there. But add those two numbers together. Pop quiz, shout it out, 65%. What does that mean? It means 35% of voters are not picking either of these two candidates if they're not very likely to vote. Most of them are picking, we do have an independent candidate on the governor's ballot. They're picking her, or they're picking don't know. There's a lot of those, or they're saying, I'm not going to answer your question. And so you just see how different the two are. 96% of the green bars, the certain to vote, have a choice between these two major party candidates, but only 65% of the less likely voters do. You'll see more about those less likelies in just a second. If we go to the Senate race, among all registered voters, the green bars, Johnson's lead is a 3-point lead instead of a 2-point lead. You go to the purple bars, it's a 1-point lead, the pretty likely to vote, and then finally the likely voters, the certain to vote, it's again a 2-point lead. So turnout's not making much of a difference this time. We saw some bigger gaps a month ago. And again, if you look at, again, we've just seen the green bars, the certain to vote, but look at the purple bars. Here it's 76% who have chosen one of the candidates among the less likely to vote, but that still leaves us with a full quarter of the less likely voters who don't have a preference between Barnes and Johnson. So again, why is that? Well, let's see. Here's the dramatic difference in enthusiasm to vote between likely voters in green and less than likely voters in purple. Among likely voters, 79% very enthusiastic to vote. Among the less likely, just 11%. In part, this should explain to you why we define likely voters as those who are certain to vote. They are very different in their political engagement compared to anybody who doesn't say they're sure they're going to vote. Now, there is a little bit of a bump in that 41% somewhat enthusiastic among less likely voters. It's possible some of those folks go to the polls, but the gap between these two is just a vivid illustration of how large the gap is and how relatively less engaged less likely voters are compared to likely voters. The second question is, how often do you follow political news? 77% of likely voters follow news about politics most of the time. Half that, 36% of less likely voters follow political news, and so on down over to the right where you see 47% of less likely voters follow it only now and then or not hardly at all. So these are big differences, and they're part of why you saw so many people undecided or not choosing between the two party candidates in the earlier slide. So some of these folks could decide to vote. Some of their choices might be consequential, certainly in a close race like this. That's why I showed you the 3 bars for all registered, pretty likely, and likely voters to see how much difference it makes. This time it didn't seem to make that much difference, but we've seen bigger differences in the past. But it's also why thinking less likely voters might suddenly sweep into the electorate is unlikely given their levels of political engagement and their enthusiasm about voting and their knowledge of the candidates. Among those less likely voters, over 40% say they don't know enough about the candidates to have an opinion of them. And again, that just goes with, you're doing other things. You're not paying a lot of attention to politics. Okay, so that's where we stand in the race. Turnout, turnout, turnout. But in a race that's 2 toss-up races like this, with very little difference between registered voters and likely voters, just a 1-point difference in those 2 margins. Modest changes in turnout between now and Election Day can still make a difference. And we'll see sometime Tuesday night or Wednesday morning where that stands. Let's look at the candidate images a bit. One of the things we've seen all year, and it continues to be true, is that all 4 candidates turn out to be relatively balanced in favorable and unfavorable opinions. They're a shade negative, but just a shade negative. And Michael's is dead even. Evers is 2 points net negative. Very few people know the independent Joan Beglinger. This is not because people have real mixed feelings about them. It's because Democrats really like the Democratic candidate and dislike the Republican candidate, and vice versa. Republicans are no fans of Governor Evers, and they are big fans of Tim Michels. And so we are pretty divided in our perceptions of these candidates along party lines. But that didn't stop us collectively from having substantially net negative views of both presidential candidates in 2016 and in 2020. And so there is a more even divide here. Maybe that's party unity on the one hand. It's certainly not for lack of criticism of all the candidates that might have driven down views of them. The one thing that we do see over time is that the negative impressions, especially for the 2 non-incumbent candidates, Barnes in the Senate race and Michels in the governor's race, those numbers have gone up since August, while don't knows have come down, while their positive traits haven't moved by very much. The 2 incumbents, Evers and Johnson, have hardly changed at all over that time. A couple of points, but no real meaningful change. So it does show that people that weren't familiar with the non-incumbent candidates became more familiar, but they were more likely to develop new negative feelings towards them rather than positive feelings. one structural reason for that is, when do people get to know candidates? In the primary. But who are you most likely to get to know? The candidates in your party's primary. So you come out of the primary with pretty positive feelings among that party, but independents and opposite partisans know less about the candidates at that point, and so they're more likely to learn during the fall campaign, and of course, the hard punches that are thrown during that time. If we look at the Senate race, it's pretty similar. Barnes is a little net negative by 4 points. Johnson is net negative by 3 points. The thing I just said about growing familiarity applies to Barnes here. With Johnson, though, he started out the year at about 9 points net negative and has just gradually poll to poll improved that, so that now at just 3 points net negative, that's as good as he's been all year. So you have seen some improvement for him over the course of the year, even though it hadn't quite gotten him up to net positive territory, as you see for the other candidates as well, remaining a little net negative. This is a pair of questions we've asked all year. Which of the candidates understands the problems of ordinary people in Wisconsin? Here, Governor Evers has a small advantage, a 4-point edge over Tim Michels on that question. In the Senate race, it's a 1-point advantage for Johnson on that at this point. There's been modest movement in that. The two Democrats have had a bit of an advantage earlier in the fall, and now, as you can see, that's pretty much been reduced, so it's a little tighter, but not a big advantage either way. What about shares my values? 48 to 46 say Evers shares their values, but with Michels, it's 41 shares, 47 does not share, a little bit more negative view there for him, though also a higher percentage saying they don't know on this question, 11% don't know. On the Senate race, 44-46 for Barnes, slightly negative. For Johnson, a 5-point net negative, 44-49. So again, pretty similar balance, but slightly worse for the Republican than for the Democrat. Here, familiarity with the candidates is more similar than it was for the governor's race, 9-7. Barnes just slightly less familiar, whereas Michels was a little bit more unfamiliar than Evers. What about cares about people like you? Evers has a noticeable advantage here, a +12 on cares, while Michels a -3. If you look through these as a set, you see pretty even distribution. Maybe both of them are a little bit net negative. Where there's a difference, there seems to be a little edge to the Democrat. But remember, we're tied in the governor's race on the vote choice. So it doesn't look like these personality traits are different enough across the candidates to drive a real advantage in vote choice. On the Senate side, Barnes has an advantage on this too, a +7, while Johnson's a -6 on cares about people like you. So again, here we have a race in which Johnson is leading the race, but on this particular personality trait, there's an advantage to Barnes. Evers' job approval is 1 point underwater, 46% approve, 47 disapprove. Unsurprising, big party difference there. Democrats like him, Republicans don't. But here, independents are again split evenly. 44% approve of the job he's doing, 45% disapprove. Again, exactly the makings you would expect of a 48-48 overall race. Yeah, here's the trend on Evers, and you can see all the past, but just look to the right in the current year. And what that has done is in February, Evers was a net +9 in job approval. Then it went to +6, +3, +2, +1, -3, then -2, and now -1. And so the downward slide, which had been going on all year from February into September, has seemingly stopped going down, but going up 1 point and then one more point is, I guess, better than going down 1 point from his point of view. But it's hardly a dramatic recovery, and he remains at -1 again, awfully close to just pure toss-up territory on this. It is obvious that earlier in his term, in his first, second, and even most of the third year, he was net positive on this measure. So it really is something that's changed this year. But it started in February before the hard campaigning really began. So I don't think this is only a function of the fall campaign. It's something that we were seeing throughout the year. Issue concerns, we've been asking about these issues for over a year, since August of last year. Inflation remains the #1 issue. It's from left to right, so the one far to the right is the highest concern. This is the percent very concerned about each of these issues. #2 is public schools, #3 crime, then gun violence, then an accurate vote count. Abortion policy is well down the list. And then we drop off again to taxes, illegal immigration, and the thing that we're apparently all over with, coronavirus. Okay? Maybe. Inflation had risen, has been at the top of the list basically for the last year and a couple of months. But you can see that it went up from last summer through the fall and peaked in June of this year. Fell off a little bit in August and has basically been flat since August. So we're not seeing concern go steadily down. It does seem that we kind of reached a peak in June that's slightly less, but it still remains a high issue concern. It's high with Republicans, where it's the second highest after ensuring an accurate vote count. It's also high with independents. It's low with Democrats. If we just look at the gaps between the parties, illegal immigration is the top left because it's the one where we have the biggest difference between Republicans and Democrats. It's not quite the highest issue concern for Republicans, but the gap between the parties is big. But then you get accurate vote count, which bumps up a little bit for Republicans, but drops off a lot for independents and some more for Democrats. Crime, high for Republicans, medium for independents, low for Democrats. Then after all that, we get inflation, high for Republicans and high for independents, but drops off quite a bit with Democrats. Taxes, a good deal lower, but more of a concern with Republicans and independents, less so for Democrats. Public schools is pretty much an equally important issue across the partisan divide. The policies might not agree between the parties, but the concern with the issue is stable. Everybody's low on coronavirus, though Democrats are a little bit more concerned than Republicans are. And then we get the Democratic issues, gun violence, where Democrats are a good deal more concerned, independents lower, and Republicans a little bit lower than independents. And finally, abortion policy, which ranked well down with everyone, is quite high. It's in fact the #1 issue with Democrats. So as we've seen all year, the top 2 or 3 issues that Republicans cite are completely different from the top 2 or 3 issues that Democrats cite, and independents mix the two a little bit, but inflation up there with independents, but so are public schools, for example. Okay, let's look at some particular issues. The abortion decision, of course, continues to be in the news and to be played in ads and campaigns. This just is how much have you heard about the abortion decision? And it's 78% who say they've heard a lot. And that's pretty high across the party spectrum. Now, everyone will agree this is a landmark decision. So it's not just your average run-of-the-mill Supreme Court decision. But for most Supreme Court decisions, we'd see something like 20% on this. So it really is striking how much more attention was paid, and paid across all three party groups to this. And some a little, and almost nobody says they've really heard nothing at all about it. And again, that would be very different. Even if we asked about the Fifth Amendment or the Second Amendment decision over the summer about carrying a weapon outside the home. In our national polling, that's far less visible than the abortion decision. We didn't ask about it on this survey, but would undoubtedly be the case if we had. The difference in opinion on this is striking by party, and the balance is still 37% favor the decision striking down Roe versus Wade, 55% opposed. That's a small shift from last time. It was about 4 points lower on favor, about 33% last time, and it was about 60% opposed last time. So it looks like maybe there's a little tightening of opinion here. And if you look at the trend by party, Republicans favoring overturning Roe has gone up a little bit since August. Democrats remain very strongly opposed to it no matter. So there's a little bit of drift here, but still a sizable majority opposed to that decision overturning Roe. And a very big partisan gap too, with a big majority, almost 3/4 of Republicans in favor of that decision, over 90% Democrats opposed. But among independents, 52 opposed, 35 in favor. So independents lean pretty strongly opposed to the decision. We've been asking this question as well, whether the state should allow legal abortions in cases of rape or incest. 84% say that should be the law, 10% are opposed, and 6% or so say they don't know. We keep following this to see if there's any evolution of it over the course of the fall campaign. There's been very little. It's been, while the favor or oppose overturning Roe has shifted by maybe 5 points. This one hasn't shifted by very much. And big majorities of all three parties favor that legalization in the new legislative session in the spring. No matter what the outcome of these elections, that will obviously still be an issue for lawmakers and the governor in the spring. We're also looking ahead here to next year's budget cycle. Again, regardless of who wins the election, there will be state budgets to deal with in the spring. The one option is increasing funding for vouchers for kids to use in private or religious schools throughout the state, and how much to expand that. We asked, would you prefer to do that expansion of vouchers or put money into public schools? And you can see by a little over 2-to-1, people prefer putting that money into public schools. We've asked a question earlier in the year in which we phrased the question differently about giving people vouchers to attend a school if they chose to do so. And with that framing, vouchers are considerably more popular. So the question from a budget making and a policy making point of view is, how much is there an inherent conflict between vouchers and public schools, or do you see it all as, how do we fund education? We'll let the legislature and the governor take care of that debate. But if it's framed as vouchers versus public schools, as we asked the question here, where would you want the state budget money to go? There's a preference for public schools rather than voucher schools. What about the trade-off between property taxes and public school funding? Because we do still pay for much of our public education through property taxes. And this month, that's a pretty even split. 46% say it's more important to cut or hold down property taxes. 48% say more important to fund public schools. This is a measure that's moved around over time. More people said lower property taxes rather than public schools in 2012 and 13 and 14. But beginning in 2015, we saw a big increase in support for funding public schools. That number went up into the 60% to 65% range during much of 2015, 16, 17, into 2018 when it started to equalize a little bit. And over the last year, we've asked it several times. Several of those readings have been in the 50s for funding public schools and the lower 40s for property tax cuts. But as you can see in this month's poll, they're basically even. So again, this will be part of the budget making process next spring, if we can look past next Tuesday's election and think about that. But there has been some movement. You'll see that independents are about evenly divided on this, and the partisan gap is really quite substantial. So there'll be obviously differences of views across parties on this. There were also on the previous question as well. How about increased state funding for local police? This is something that has occasionally been debated in the legislature, as I understand it, has been reluctant to provide funding to municipalities to pay for police. So this would be an interesting policy shift. But we've seen support from it from candidates. And you can see that a solid majority, say 78%, say the state should increase funding for police. And there's a partisan gap, but it's a majority of all party groups, including a huge majority among Republicans. So presuming there's still a Republican legislature in the spring making the budget, it'll be interesting to see whether the campaign politics that have been part of this carry over into policy making in the spring, and whether Democrats who are a little less supportive or a bit less supportive, how they feel about whatever might come out of that. But it certainly on the face of it looks like a lot of support for increased support for municipalities in their police budgets. Parental leave is another issue that's sort of new. It came up in the Republican primary debate in which all three Republican candidates expressed some degree of support for a parental leave policy. I asked the question a little more directly about whether businesses should be required to provide paid parental leave. So that's not something that any of the candidates directly address. Let me be clear. That's my question about requiring businesses. But even with that fairly hard wording, 73% support requiring paid parental leave. And that includes 62% of Republicans, a little bit more of that among independents, and a good deal more among Democrats. So again, a policy that may or may not bubble up in the legislature, but one that got put on the agenda in that primary debate, I think. How about the direction of the state? Well, we're still headed in the wrong direction or the wrong track. This has just been a perennial this year. Only 34% say we're headed in the right direction. 58% say we're off on the wrong track. Democrats are the one group that see the right direction. But independents, as you see, 34 to 59 say wrong track. And Republicans are very much wrong track. So big differences there. Yeah, here's the trend in that question over the last few years. And you can see we were a little optimistic in 2019 and early 2020. We stopped asking the question for a while because we were asking so many questions about COVID, there just wasn't room for it. But when we picked it up again and national polling showed the same thing, these have flipped with wrong track, the dominant view. But if you look at it since 2021, you see not only are we solidly on the wrong track, but that gap has actually grown a bit over the last 2 years. We've actually gotten more pessimistic about, this is the question about the direction of the state of Wisconsin specifically, not about national right direction, wrong track, but the national question produces the same kind of results. So I've called the electorate grumpy this year. I think they're still grumpy, and this is probably the number one example of this, that we're, if not grumpy, we're at least pessimistic. And who knows when and how that changes. Family financial situation is one reason why that might change. 50% of registered voters say that they are living comfortably. We ask about your family's financial situation. But 38% say they're just getting by, and 10% say they're struggling. There are some party differences here, with Democrats feeling a little better about their financial situations, Republicans less. That raises a question about how much of that is actual objective income or wealth versus how much of it is filtered through a partisan lens. And partisan filtering is part of that. But also don't forget the changing structure of the Republican Party, where white working class men in particular have become much more Republican than they were a decade ago. And so there is a shift in the socioeconomic makeup of the Republican Party compared to where it was 10 or 20 years ago. And so some of this may be changes in the objective financial conditions that the parties hold, as well as the well-known partisan lenses that filter how we perceive more or less objective situations, but nevertheless see them differently depending on partisanship and who the president is. But there is clearly a trend in this that is quite negative and might account for some of that grumpiness as well. Some of this is inflation and some of it is economic growth, though unemployment still looks so low that it's hard to think that's the driver. But look at the green line, that's living comfortably, and you can see it was really flat for 2 or 3 years. And again, there was an interruption during COVID when we didn't ask it several times. But now in this year, you can see it was a little bit lower at the start of the year, but has tailed off a little bit in the most recent polling. And the just getting by has clearly moved up from where it was in 2019 and 2020. So there are greater concerns about your family's financial situation, not just whether we're headed in the right direction or the wrong track. Accuracy, we're coming up on an election, right? You might have heard that election integrity has been a topic of some discussion for the last couple of years. So this time we asked this question about how confident are you that the votes will be accurately cast and counted in this November's election, as opposed to the 2020 election. And of course, we're going to compare those two in just a second. And what you see is that 45% very confident plus 32 somewhat confident gives us 77% what we might call confident in this upcoming election. 12% not too confident and 8% not at all confident, 20% total with some doubts about this upcoming election. Too bad we didn't ask this question in 2018 or 2016, but anyway, so we don't have that comparison. You can see that Republicans are more doubtful. About a third of Republicans expressed doubts in the upcoming election, though, look at the other side, over 63% of Republicans are confident that the election will be conducted accurately. Now, look at the question for 2020, looking back at the 2020 presidential election. And let me just take you over to the right. The 14% not too confident plus 19% not at all confident. So that's a third, 33% say they're not confident about 2020, back up, compared to 20% not confident about this upcoming election. So it's a difference between 1 in 5 voters concerned about this November versus 1 in 3 voters who are concerned about 2020. So there is a difference between those two. And again, look at Republicans, the most skeptical. 1/3 of Republicans skeptical about this upcoming election versus 60% of Republicans skeptical about 2020. So again, we see that this year, there is more doubt among Republicans, but it's considerably less concern going into this race versus the very great concern, 60% concerned about the 2020 election. So of course, much will still depend on how the election goes, on whether people accept the results of the election, whether there are new concerns, criticisms, claims about the election. But at the very least, going into this one, it looks like doubts about the prospects of this election are less dire than looking back to 2020. And even if we look back to 2020, you get 65% over here in the very confident and somewhat confident. It's important to recognize that basically 2/3 are confident about 2020 and 1/3 are doubtful of the public at large. And looking ahead, it's 77% confident about the upcoming election, so a bit more confidence and a bit less doubt. So time will tell how this election goes and whether the results are accepted widely. But we do see some evidence that the doubts about elections now, about 2020, are not as pervasive for upcoming elections. That's good, right? It would be bad if the same people that are really worried about 2020 were equally worried about the upcoming election, but check back in after the election and see where we are then. There's other news over the summer, and that was the January 6th committee hearings and the one that they held a month or so ago. So we asked about that. 55% said they'd heard a lot about that. Compare that with the 80% that had heard a lot about the Supreme Court's abortion decision. So this is pretty visible, but it's not as visible as that. It's, I think, interesting that all three partisan groups have heard a lot about the hearings, though just under 50% for Republicans. But given the different partisan views of those hearings, the fact that there's as small a gap in awareness of the hearings by party is, I think, an interesting factoid. There's a little bit of difference in the people that claim to have heard nothing at all about it. So there are some gaps there. But the takeaways from the hearings are quite different depending on party. We asked the question, how much responsibility does Donald Trump bear for the violence of some of his supporters on January 6th? 48% say a lot, but 32% say none at all. And 17% say some. So it's more that say quite a lot than none at all, but it's still not completely lopsided at all. And you see these big partisan differences again, with 60% of Republicans saying no responsibility at all, 94% of Democrats saying a lot. With independents, it's 46 a lot, 35 none at all. So again, a pretty similar to the overall balance of opinion on this issue. The bottom line is that when we've asked this over time, we've seen virtually no change. And so it doesn't seem like the hearings have changed anybody's minds. And part of that is that opinion about it is structured through party and obviously support or opposition to Donald Trump. But the hearings themselves in our data don't show shifts in the answer to this question since June. Here's a more recent one, and it's just a straightforward factual question. Do you believe that Donald Trump had top secret and classified and national security documents at Mar-a-Lago this summer? Just that question. Did he have them or not? 55% say he did half that, 27% say he did not, and then 16% say they don't know whether he did or didn't. There are big partisan differences, with just over half of Republicans saying no, he did not have any of those documents at Mar-a-Lago, and 27% that he did. But independents, again, look very much like the population as a whole. 55% say he did, but a quarter, 26% say he did not, and 18% say they don't know. Whereas Democrats are utterly convinced that he had secret documents there, 88%. Just 4% say he didn't, though 8% say they're not sure. Just in the kinds of comments people make in the interviews, it's clear that Donald Trump's message that if he took the documents, they were automatically declassified. And we'd hear people say, well, I think he had documents, but I think they were declassified. So my answer to your question is no. So it's interesting that people have that message and to some extent are repeating it. And it certainly shows that you can say no to this question and have followed those claims by Trump about the nature of the documents and the nature of declassification. Still, there is quite a divide on this issue, and presumably the courts will play that out over the next 2 or 3 decades. That's a little joke. I don't think it'll be more than 1 decade, but I could be wrong. Biden's job approval is hardly changed this month. 41% approve, 54% disapprove. Giant partisan gap with Republicans massively disapproving, but independents solidly disapproving as well, 56 to 36. A little worse performance with independents for Biden than the overall balance between these two opinions. The 90% of Democrats that approve is something that's come up over the course of the summer and fall. Biden had fallen into the 70s or low 80s of approval among Democrats, and that has improved over the course of the campaign, whether through the legislative action that took place over the summer or because of some leveling off, at least, of inflation and gas prices or something else. Or maybe it's just party loyalty reasserting itself as we've come into the election period. Here's his job approval overall and the trends in it. There have been bigger trends nationally than there have been here in the state, though generally his approval here in the state has been in the low 40s, pretty close to what the national opinion has been at the same point in time. These are things that we always include. Tammy Baldwin's favorability as the other sitting senator, 37-37, a dead even split there. This is the release of toss-ups. Almost everything I've shown you, at least on the vote choice and the personality traits and all of that, are toss-ups. They're inside the margins of error. Trump's favorability, also not much change, 39 favorable, 53 unfavorable. He's still net negative, but the unfavorable has gone down a little bit, 3 or 4 points. The favorables have gone up 3 or 4 points, but not big differences. And of course, very big party divides. Okay, and then the thing I started with, because you forgot, didn't you? Polls aren't going to vote. There is no registered voter named the Marquette Law School poll. So it really is up to you and in your hands. Good luck. Go and do well. All right. Thank you so much. We'll be back next year.